Extraction. A kid sensation story. Written by Kevin Hardman. Narrated by Michael Naramore. Part 1. When I told my girlfriend Electra about my impending criminal activities, I didn't get quite the reaction I expected. "I'm in," she said with almost no hesitation. A natural beauty with straight dark hair, she obviously had no problem being decisive. The response was the same from my best friend's smokescreen. "You can't leave me out," Smokey said. As an empath, I sensed that he felt almost cheerful about it, even though I typically ignore the feelings of those around me. We were sitting around the dining room table at Smokey's house at the time, a cozy two-story affair in a mostly middle-class neighborhood. His parents were having a date night, and since he was the only kid still living at home, we had the place to ourselves. That made it perfect for letting them know what I intended to do. I had briefly considered telling them a few days earlier at my house, but I lived with two world-class telepaths. Although my mother and grandfather usually don't read other people's thoughts, I was afraid that, after I told them what I was planning, Electra and Smokey might be so distressed that their thoughts would be an open invitation to any psychic in shouting distance. Apparently, I needn't have worried, because both were clearly on board with what I was planning, although that was never my intention. "Look," I said to both of them, "my telling you wasn't an invitation to tag along. I told you so that someone would know what had happened to me if this thing goes sideways." "Well, you said it was the same guys who tried to kill us at the academy," Smokey responded. "So I'm interested in a little payback." The academy was, emphasis on was, our school, a training ground for future superheroes. Just a few weeks earlier, an allegedly rogue government agent named Schaefer infected the students there with a potentially lethal virus that also affected their powers. Long story short, the academy ended up being destroyed, to put it mildly, but most of the students survived. My friend Adam Atom wasn't so lucky, and I curled my fist in anger just thinking about it. "I understand how you feel, but this isn't a vendetta we're talking about," I said, voicing words contrary to what I actually felt. "It's a rescue operation. An extraction." In essence, the organization that Schaefer had worked for was not only still in operation, but possibly the most powerful government agency on the planet. They had previously attempted to literally snatch me off the street, and they might have been successful but for some help I received from a 10-year-old psychic girl named Rudy. She and her brother Josh were being held by that same organization as part of a Black Ops program called Chamomile, but I had sworn to Rudy that I would get them out. The time had come to make good on that promise. "But what if you get caught, Jim?" Electra asked. "Then I'm stuck waiting 40 years for you to come up for parole." "You'd wait for me?" I asked with a sly smile. Electra groaned. "Just show us the blueprints and schematics again." I laid the requested documents out on the table, holding a couple of them down telekinetically when it seemed like they wanted to roll back up like the tube they had come in. They referred to the secret facility where Rudy and her brother were being held. Every page was stamped with phrases like classified, top secret, and eyes only in huge glaring letters. There was also some small print on the bottom of each that said something about fines and prison for misuse, as well as wrongful possession and retention, but I saw no need to make mention of that. "Are you sure this is where they're being held?" Smokey asked. "I'd stake my life on it," I answered. I'd gotten the documents from Brain Trust, a friend whose expertise was knowledge and information. If BT said that this was the place, then this was the place. The blueprints for the Chamomile facility actually showed two layouts. One was for a huge 50,000-square-foot building sitting out in the middle of nowhere, a dry, arid region of the country that was mostly desert. The second diagram was for an adjoining structure, 3 times as big, and located 150 feet underground. Per the blueprints, the only way to traverse the space from one building to the other was a single connecting elevator, and naturally the area we needed to access was in the subterranean building. I know you guys want to help, I said, but I've got this one under control.
Okay, genius,
Electra said, crossing her arms.
What's your plan?
Since I know where the facility is, I can just phase in through the walls like a ghost, zip around from room to room at super speed until I find Rudy and Josh, then teleport out of there.
And 2 hours later, the men in black will be knocking on your door,
she said. How's that? I asked.
I'm looking at the schematics for the electrical systems, she said, and I see wiring for cameras among other things.
So?
So what do you think happens when they look at what the video captured and see you teleport out of there? Or if someone just reports that they saw you do it?
I shrugged. I don't know. I guess they'll say a teleporter popped in and popped out.
And would you agree that teleporting's a rare ability? She asked.
One of the rarest.
So when they look for who did this, they narrow it down to teleporters, which is already a short list. You also mentioned superspeed and phasing. How many teleporters also have both of those abilities?
I didn't bother answering. I put my face in my hands and grunted in frustration. Basically, I was the only super, at least the only one I knew of, with a power set that included the talents Electra had pointed out, not to mention a whole lot more. Having a smorgasbord of powers is what helped me get slapped with the name Kid Sensation.
So basically, Smokey added, if you go in with an open kimono flashing everything you've got, they'll narrow the pool of potential culprits down pretty quick.
So what? I snapped. Even if they know it's me, I've got diplomatic immunity. I'm untouchable.
And this is the type of thing that can get you stripped of that immunity, Electra retorted. Blatant, overt, and intentional commission of a crime.
Actually, she was only half right. Typically, when a diplomat committed a crime, immunity could be waived by the nation of origin, but it couldn't be stripped by the host country. In my case, my diplomatic status was the result of my maternal grandmother being an alien princess. She had originally been designated a diplomat from her planet, but she had returned back home when my mother was still an infant. Now, through the machinations of friends and family, I somehow found myself burdened with the official title of diplomat from my grandmother's homeworld, never mind the fact that I was born and reared on Earth, and have never even seen or communicated with anyone from the planet I nominally represented. In essence, since there was no one from my grandmother's planet who outranked me here on Earth, the only person who could strip me of my immunity was, drumroll please, me. Still, I understood and acknowledged Electra's point. So, what do you suggest? I asked.
You pick a single solitary power to use, not teleportation, when we go into this place, she responded. When we three go, that is, Smokey added.
We spent the next hour studying the schematics, which revealed several potential points of ingress and egress regarding the facility, some of which were less popular than others. For instance, Electra put the kibosh on the idea of utilizing the sewer lines.
I'll feel filthy for weeks afterwards, she stated, regardless of how things turn out.
In the end, we'd settled on utilizing the air vents. According to the schematics, the underground structure had numerous ventilation shafts that broke the surface at various widespread points.
There's at least 24 vents spread out over an area of at least a couple of square miles, Smokey noted. Why so many?
Even buildings on the surface need HVAC systems, I said. Air handlers, cooling towers, etc., in order to get high-quality air. These guys have a huge facility, so big it has its own power plant, and 3/4 of it is completely underground. They need massive amounts of airflow, which means a lot of air vents. Smokey nodded his head in agreement, and I smiled to myself. It may have sounded as though I knew what I was talking about, but I was essentially regurgitating stuff BT had told me when he'd gone over the blueprints and schematics with me.
So we just pick a vent and go in?
Electra asked. Not exactly, I said. I pointed to a specific area on the drawing. This is the vent that we want to go in. It connects to the shaft that terminates the closest to the living quarters, which is our destination.
So if you're not supposed to be teleporting us, how do we get to that vent?
Smokey asked. They can't monitor every square inch of the desert, I answered. It's impractical. Assuming everybody's okay with it, I believe we're safe with me teleporting us to within about a mile of the shaft. I think that's far enough out that there aren't likely to be any cameras watching us come and go. Plus, they've got some kind of motion sensor that picks up anything that gets much closer than that.
Oh, so you saw that on the schematics too? Electra asked.
No. I grimaced. I may have triggered it when I went to check the place out last week.
What?
Electra asked, aghast. I was planning a rescue mission, I said defensively. I couldn't teleport in because I'd never been there before. So I popped up as close as possible, a few 100 miles away, and zipped over at super speed.
And you got within about a mile and then an alarm went off?
Smokey asked. It sounded more like an air raid siren, but yeah, I said. I tried approaching from 3 different directions, and it was the same every time. Electra put her face in her hands and practically screamed in frustration.
How did I get such an idiot for a boyfriend?
It's fine, I insisted. I was in and out so fast that they probably thought it was a glitch or a bug.
Once is a glitch or a bug, she said. 3 times is someone testing your perimeter, your security.
I blinked, somewhat in shock. This is the kind of thing I should have recognized on my own. I'd been so intent on keeping my promise to Rudy that I hadn't been giving any serious thought to strategy, tactics, etc., despite all the training I'd been given.
Speaking of security,
Smokey said, trying to get back on task,
what are we talking about here?
His question snapped me out of my reverie. The whole area's a no-fly zone, so presumably they have radar.
Which explains why you hoofed it over there instead of flying, he said.
I nodded. There are a total of 45 security guards working 3 shifts, so 15 guards per shift. At any given time, 12 of them are on duty in the subsurface facility.
12 guards,
Smokey said in contemplation.
Seems kind of lightweight.
There's also at least 2 supers, I added.
Of course,
Smokey said before adding sarcastically, why wouldn't there be?
Any idea who the supers might be?
Electra asked. No, I said. Why? You think they might extend us a little professional courtesy and look the other way?
Hardly, she responded. I'm more interested in knowing their abilities.
I shrugged. There are a lot of supers willing to hire out as mercenaries, and the guys we're up against have deep pockets. I reflected back for a moment on the fiasco at the academy, where one such merc, a super called Estrella, had almost punched my ticket.
I hate to break it to you,
Electra said, interrupting my train of thought.
But I'm not sure we'll be able to use the vents. According to the security details, even those shafts have motion sensors installed, although no cameras.
In other words, I said, we need a new plan. Shortly thereafter, we called it a night, with everybody promising to give some more thought to the matter over the next few days. Needless to say, I was extremely frustrated. I'd made a promise to Rudy, and she was counting on me. There had to be a way to get this done. It was several days later that I had my eureka moment. I was fully preoccupied, as I had been of late, with thoughts of how to manage this rescue operation. If an idea occurred to get us in, I couldn't think of a way out. In contrast, if I worked backward and started with an exit strategy, I couldn't think of an appropriate way in. I was wrapped up in that mental deadlock, thinking about how Rudy was going to be a grandmother before I came up with a plan, when the solution hit me. From my perspective, it was so beautiful, so elegant in its simplicity that I could have kicked myself for not thinking of it before. I hurriedly convened a meeting with my two literal partners in crime. Their response was less enthusiastic than I had hoped. In fact, when I finished explaining it, they both looked at me like I was a talking rabbit.
You know,
Electra said after a few moments of awkward silence,
when I called you an idiot the other day, I had no idea I was paying you a compliment. That's your plan? That's not a plan. It's not even half a plan.
Hold on,
said Smokey, playing peacemaker.
The first part has merit, although it could use a few tweaks. But Jim, the second part? You have to admit it's a little nuts.
No, it only sounds nuts because you guys have never seen anything like it, I said. But trust me, it'll work.
Even with this place on total lockdown?
Smokey asked.
Because that's what's going to happen within the first minute of us initiating this plan of yours, before we even get inside, and this is the part I'm most comfortable with.
Lockdown, if you look at the plans and security data, I said, is really geared towards keeping people in rather than out.
Yeah,
Electra chimed in.
And getting out is where your plan seems to ask us to put you in a straitjacket.
I appreciate how you feel, but it'll be okay, I said. Smokey and Electra exchanged a skeptical glance. Fine, I said defensively. You don't have to believe me, but make no mistake. I'm doing this, with or without your help. Part 2. Of course, there was no way they were going to let me go it alone. Thus, we planned our extraction for the upcoming weekend, specifically Saturday night. Being teenagers, it wouldn't surprise anyone that we were out at the time, and with any luck, we would be gone only a few hours at most. As I mentioned before, the facility we were trying to break into had its own power plant. Per the diagrams, that power was principally derived from a nearby wind farm, a massive plot of land peppered with wind turbines. That was our first destination. Having previously scoped out the area, and not triggering any sensors, I was able to teleport us right up to the edge of the wind farm. We were all wearing stealth suits, which resembled skin-tight, grayish-white leotards with face-hugging hoods. They were made of some weird material that was surprisingly comfortable, and which would purportedly allow us to slip past any active motion sensors. The suits would, among other things, hide body heat and absorb sound waves, making us invisible to things like thermal imagery, radar, sonar, and the like. The suits were Smokey's idea, although I had no idea how he managed to get his hands on them. They also came with night vision goggles, gloves, miniature rebreathers, and backpacks. All in all, we looked like some bleached-out version of a Blue Man Group.
Wow,
said Smokey, marveling at the sight before us. And in truth, even seen through NVGs, it really was impressive. Acres of massive wind turbines, each 200 feet tall with blades 50 feet long, practically spinning in unison. Unfortunately, we didn't have much time to admire the view. Electra was the first to break the spell of the wind turbines.
Let's get this show on the road.
With that, she stepped up to the closest turbine and laid a gloved hand on it. With her goggles in place, I couldn't really see her eyes, but I imagined she had them shut, and I could feel her concentrating as small arcs of electricity began forming around the area where she was touching the turbine. The electricity around her hand seemed to become more powerful, and both Smokey and I involuntarily took a step back. Suddenly, Electra's arm stiffened, and I heard a distinctive crackling noise as a bolt of electricity seemed to shoot through the turbine. A second later, there was a sound like a dozen street lamps exploding, and we looked up to see a glorious shower of sparks raining down from the turbine's shaft. I wrinkled my nose as I caught the scent of burning insulation and ozone.
That should do it,
Electra said. What that should have done, if we were lucky, was shoot an electrical spike into Chamomile's power grid strong enough to take its power plant offline. Unfortunately, the place had a backup generator, powered hydroelectrically by an underground river, but it would take about 15 minutes to come online. Without a word, I scooped Electra up into my arms and took off running, depositing her at the air vent we were planning to use. Then I ran back for Smokey. I could have teleported, but Electra had insisted that I get into character, basically only using a single superpower, speed. I was back at the turbine within a minute. I reached for Smokey, but he slapped my hand away.
Dude, what do you think you're doing? He asked. You're not carrying me like some chick you're saving from an apartment fire.
Before I could say anything, he motioned for me to turn around, then hopped on my back. I take it your male pride is okay with this? I asked as I shifted his weight.
Tally-o,
he replied. Shortly thereafter, we arrived at the ventilation shaft and I practically dumped him on the ground. The vent itself was essentially a 3 by 3 foot square-shaped piece of metal that extended about 2 feet above the ground. At each of its 4 corners was a metal rod about 6 inches long, and screwed down onto those rods was a cymbal-shaped covering. A high volume of air blew up forcefully and noisily from the shaft. Pulling a screwdriver from my backpack, I shifted into superspeed, removing the screws and then taking the covering, which was obviously intended to keep out the elements, from the vent. I did the same thing to a grate that was screwed in place at the top of the shaft opening. Since the moment I had brought her to the vent, Electra had been busy with an item from her own backpack. It was a steel rod of adjustable length, with metal grips on the ends. It also had a generous amount of grappling line in the center, and a 3-man harness attached. With the vent now accessible, she came over and, after making sure it was the proper length, placed the rod so that the ends of it fit over the opposite sides of the ventilation shaft. Then she adjusted the grips so that the rod wouldn't move. Seemingly satisfied that it was safe, she grabbed the harness and strapped herself in.
Well,
she said after adjusting the harness around her waist.
We don't have all night.
Smokey and I quickly strapped ourselves in as well, and a few minutes later, we were slowly descending down the shaft, with Electra holding the controls for the grappling line and Smokey shining a flashlight so we could see where we were going. Frankly speaking, all of this effort felt kind of foolish to me, and a bit like a waste of time. I could have phased us into the vent and then flown all 3 of us down the shaft. It was about a 50-foot drop straight down, at which point the shaft angled the rest of the way down towards the Chamomile facility. However, Electra wasn't having it.
We already talked about how you were only going to use 1 power on this mission, almost from cradle to grave, she'd said. Plus, what if something happens to you? At least with the harness in place, there's a chance that we can get out, especially if your crazy plan goes to pieces.
So, I was stuck in the harness, moving at what felt like was a snail's pace. The air in the vent blew wildly, and if it wasn't tucked into her hood, I was sure Electra's hair would have been smacking me in my face every time I leaned too close to her. Although it felt longer, we were at the bottom of the shaft in just a minute or 2. Then we unhooked ourselves, pulled out the schematics, and started walking. Getting through the shaft took longer than anticipated. I had hoped that, just like on the surface, I'd be able to zip through the shaft at high speed with Electra and Smokey. As luck would have it, however, this portion of the shaft was far too narrow for me to get through carrying anyone. Hence, we went through the vents at what my friends probably considered a good pace, but which I found maddeningly slow. I spent the time reaching out empathically for Rudy. It was how I had first come into contact with her, but now I was getting nothing. It was as if she were hiding from me. It took us about 10 minutes to reach the end of the shaft. Apparently, none of us knew how to read a schematic properly because we didn't come out where we expected. We had intended to exit fairly close to the living quarters. Instead, we emerged in what, under other circumstances, I would have described as a dark, dank basement. In our defense, we did encounter a lot of interconnected shafts, and schematics aren't always accurate. However, seeing that almost all of this facility was underground, the entire thing could be classified as a basement. There was a grate over the end of the vent, but there was so much noise and wind blowing that we didn't worry about being heard when Smokey kicked it off. We peeked out and looked around. The vent we were in was located about 5 feet above the floor of what appeared to be a large tunnel. Numerous ventilation shafts similar to the one we were in dotted both sides of the passageway. Although no alarm was sounding, red lights, placed equidistant from each other in the ceiling, were flashing. As expected, when the power grid went offline, the place had gone into lockdown. A quick consultation with the diagrams revealed that we weren't too far off the mark. We were, however, a few floors beneath our intended destination. Still, we felt we had a better chance of success by getting out of the vent here rather than trying to go back through and find our intended point of egress. The three of us jumped down, Electra refusing any offer of assistance. Then we ran through the tunnel, which grew in width and height as we traveled, in the direction that the wind was coming from. When we reached the end of the passageway, we saw something that was almost as impressive as the wind farm. At this point, the tunnel was at least 50 feet tall as well as wide. Filling that entire space at the end of the passageway was a massive fan in a metal frame. The blades on it were roughly 20 feet in length, and whipping around so fast that we could actually see through to the other side of the tunnel where a single metal door was set in the wall. Not only was the fan generating an incredible amount of airflow, its movement sent notable vibrations through the ground. My companions looked at me, and I shrugged. I picked up Electra again and shifted into high speed. Sensing what I was about to do, she turned her face towards my chest. From my perspective, the blades on the fan slowed down until they were barely moving at all. At that point, it was child's play for me to simply step between them to the other side, where I lowered Electra to the ground. Then I went back and brought Smokey through, again on my back, although this time he spurred me on with a giddy up. It was after Smokey hopped off my back that I noticed the suction. Air on this side of the room was being pulled into the giant fan. The force of it wasn't strong enough for any of us to worry about being blown into the blades and turned into sushi, but it was disconcerting nonetheless. In a perfect world, there would have been grating of some type on both sides of the fan to prevent someone from getting hurt. We hurriedly made our way to the door and exited. They were waiting for us on the other side of the door, although we didn't notice them at first. Upon leaving the area with the giant fan, we found ourselves seemingly alone in some type of engineering room. The space itself was monstrously huge, both in length, width, and height, and dotted with what appeared to be generators, transformers, etc., some of them several stories high and massive in size. It quickly became obvious that we were in the main power plant. Here, as in the room we had just left, red bulbs flashed all around in place of normal lighting. There also seemed to be an inordinate number of stairways, walkways, and railings around much of the power plant equipment, as well as lining the walls. According to the blueprints, the door we needed was on the opposite wall. With me in the lead, followed by Electra and then Smokey, we began furtively making our way across the plant floor.
"Where is everybody?"
Smokey asked in a whisper as we walked down a narrow passageway between two bulky pieces of equipment. I shrugged. Probably in their rooms or whatever is designated as a secure location down here. They probably practice for stuff like this the way normal people have fire drills.
Yeah, Electra said. But from what I can see, this is the power plant. There should be a bunch of engineers in here trying to get power restored and everything back online.
I was about to object on some basis, but that actually made a lot of sense. In sudden alarm, I stopped walking, so quickly, in fact, that Electra bumped into me, then reached out to the surrounding area empathically. That's when I felt them. They numbered 8 altogether, 6 normal security guards, and 2 supers. The security guards I picked out easily. Homing in on their location with my empathic ability as I sensed their various emotions, I then telescoped my vision until I could see where each of them was positioned. Outfitted in matching uniforms and body armor, they were strategically placed on the stairs and walkways above us. In short, they had the high ground, and they all had weapons pointed at us. As to the supers, I sensed them on the ground level with us, although currently out of our line of sight. I motioned for Electra and Smokey to stay back, then stepped out of the passageway into what was essentially the center of the plant, or at least the portion with the most clear space. The 2 supers were there, about 30 feet away, standing out in the open and looking as if they were expecting me, which they obviously were. The first was a young guy, early 20s, I'd say, with brown hair, a slim build, a nose ring, and a conceited grin. He was in a fighting stance, dressed in a black and green costume, fists balled and projecting glowing spheres around his hands that fluctuated somewhere between yellow and green in the color spectrum. I sensed a certain recklessness in him, cockiness and impetuously coupled with a manic desire to prove himself. Even more, I recognized him as a meta called the Plasmatic Kid. In his teens, Plasmatic had had the misfortune of falling in with a bad crowd, and as a result, found himself eventually rounded up as a part of a massive crackdown on supervillains. However, the judge had taken pity on him because of his youth, and presumably impressionable personality, and had given him a light sentence that basically equated to being slapped on the wrist with a wet noodle. And now he had somehow ended up here at Chamomile. The other super was a different story altogether. He was older, probably mid to late 30s, although he wore his long blonde hair in a youthful ponytail. Tall and buff, he had a musculature that was clearly visible through his blue and gray outfit every time he moved. Unlike Plasmatic, who was clearly overeager and spoiling for a fight, the second super seemed almost bored. He stood in a relaxed posture, barely looking in my direction. However, emanating from him was a confidence and self-assuredness that was almost frightening in its intensity. I didn't know who he was, but I had no doubt that he knew how to handle himself, and of the 2 supers in front of me, he was unquestionably the greater threat. A second later, Smokey and Electra stepped out and took up positions on either side of me. I had told them to stay back, but apparently they didn't think I should face the threat here alone, and I loved them for it. Plasmatic's cocksure grin got even wider when he saw my friends, and he made a show of cracking his knuckles in anticipation. "That one's yours," I telepathically said to Electra, and heard her mentally acknowledge my statement. We stood there, facing each other, 3 against 8, although technically we were only face-to-face with the 2 supers. No one said a word. Nobody had to. They knew we were there to break in, and we knew they were there to stop us. Both sides were just waiting for someone to blink. I didn't think we were waiting for someone to literally blink, but that's just what happened. A few seconds after the stare-down started, the air suddenly became thick with smoke. Thanks, Smokey. As his name implied, Smokescreen actually had the ability to create copious amounts of vaporous substances, from breathable cloud-like fog to harsh, choking fumes. In addition, since being infected by the virus at the Academy, his abilities had morphed into something significantly more. Now, he could not only create smoke-like haze, he could actually become vaporous himself. In conjunction with the smoke appearing, Smokey's stealth suit dropped to the ground empty. At the same time, 7 of our adversaries suddenly began coughing violently and profusely, indicating that the mist surrounding them was of the barf-up-a-lung variety. The only exception was the big super, who was apparently holding his breath, unless he didn't need to breathe. As for myself and Electra, the smoke kept itself a reasonable 2 feet away from us, seemingly respecting our personal space, even though we were wearing rebreathers. I switched my vision over to infrared, allowing me to keep all of our opponents in sight. Presumably, Electra changed her goggles over to thermal imaging or something along those lines because she had no trouble blasting Plasmatic through the smoke with a bolt of electricity while he was caught up in the throes of a coughing fit. He flew through the air like a discarded banana peel before striking the side of a winding metal staircase and flopping down to the floor. The big super bent his legs slightly, then took a powerful leap that landed him on one of the upper walkways running along the power plant walls. An eerie yellow glow formed around his eyes, which a few seconds later shot forth 2 beams that broadened out like spotlights. The beams raked back and forth across the smoke in the area until they fell on me. The big super cocked his head to the side for a second, and his eyes narrowed slightly, as if he found something interesting about me. From his expression, you would have thought he recognized me in some way, but that was impossible. Shape-shifting is one of my abilities, and, in keeping with the theme of remaining anonymous on this mission, I had adopted a blonde-haired, blue-eyed persona. Still, it was pretty clear that the super could somehow see through the smoke. On my part, I didn't even feel the beams at all, but people don't always feel radiation either. That doesn't mean it's not harming you in some way. With that thought in mind, I zipped away at super speed. "Get going!" I mentally shouted to Electra and Smokey as I began dashing around the plant and disarming the security guards, all of whom were vehemently hacking like it was the new national pastime. Electra clearly heard me and started running towards the appropriate exit door. I presumed that Smokey heard me as well, but I had never tried to telepathically talk to him while he was in his smoke form. When I tried to locate his brain, I picked up an odd, fuzzy sensation. Regardless, the smoke seemingly began roiling in the proper direction. It only took a few seconds to get all the guards' guns. Then I zipped back into the room with the giant fan, went between the blades, and dumped the guns on the ground there. Confident that the weapons wouldn't be easily retrieved, I darted back into the power plant, picking up Smokey's discarded stealth suit and tucking it into my backpack along the way. Still coughing, Plasmatic was somehow back on his feet. Firing on the run, Electra sent a blast of electricity his way, but missed, striking the stairway by his head instead. Startled, Plasmatic began firing plasma bolts from his hands wildly in all directions through the smoke, still coughing the entire while. One of them hit a wall, blowing out a chunk of it like a stick of dynamite. Several others hit various pieces of equipment in the plant, including what looked like a generator. Another struck a walkway on which one of the guards was positioned, destabilizing it and causing it to pull away from the 3-story structure it was attached to. Still coughing, the guard didn't even have enough air to scream as the walkway pitched to the side and threw him off. I moved without thinking, racing up the side of a nearby wall and jumping out towards the falling man. Grabbing someone who's falling while moving at super speed is a lot like trying to catch a falling egg. Unless you're extremely careful, something's likely to get broken. Basically, you're a human-sized bullet about to ram another person. That being the case, I was prepared to cheat just a little. First of all, once airborne, I actually used my power of flight to make sure my trajectory was perfect. As I closed the distance to the guard, who was falling in slow motion from my perspective, I thought about how to handle the situation. The best option seemed to be to gently poke and prod him with my telekinesis, nudging him to the side in the direction I was going and subtly giving him the proper momentum. That way, as I passed him, I could hopefully catch him in a way that would do a minimum amount of damage. That whole plan altered, however, as the smoke around the guard started to change. It wasn't happening quickly from my perspective, but I could see the vapors starting to coalesce. My eyes widened as I realized what was happening, and I let myself sail by the guard without touching him.
I flipped over in the air so that my feet touched the opposite wall, then sprinted back down to the floor where I could see the action. A portion of the smoke had condensed, consolidating into a pair of hands that had grabbed the falling guard by the shoulders and were slowly lowering him to the ground. Smokey's new powers were clearly more advanced than I'd given him credit for. Movement out of the corner of my eye drew my attention. The big super with the ponytail squatted and leaped from the walkway towards Electra, who had reached the door. I rushed up a wall and leaped out at him. As with the guard, my leap actually changed to flight once I left the wall. Unlike the guard, however, I made no effort to avoid hitting this guy at full speed. I bulled into him with my shoulder, striking him along the side at his waist. It was like hitting a telephone pole, most likely inflicting more damage on me than him as I ricocheted towards a nearby wall, which I ran back down to the floor. It did, however, change the direction of his movement, like a cue ball striking one of its compadres in a game of pool. 8-ball in the side pocket, I thought, as the big fellow went straight into a power transformer. I don't know what exactly Electra had knocked offline at the wind farm, but it obviously wasn't the transformer, because the thing had to be close to being fully juiced. When the super hit, it lit up like a supernova, shooting sparks like firecrackers as electricity visibly whipped across, around, and through the guy's body. At that point, Electra was through the door, with Smokey right on her heels in vapor form. I zipped over as well, and took one last look at the power plant. Plasmatic was still on his feet, and able to get his bearings now that the smoke had fled the room. Nearby, his fellow super fell to his knees, seemingly exhausted by his torturous encounter with the transformer, which was now billowing real smoke into the room. And if that wasn't enough, a small explosion sounded from the generator that Plasmatic's shot had gone through earlier, and flames were now visible through the hole he had made. I slammed the door shut, but not before the super with the ponytail glared at me with his yellow eyes. We knew we needed to go up to get to the living quarters, so we took a nearby set of stairs as indicated on the blueprints. Something else I knew, from the look the big super had given me, was that they'd be coming after us right quick. When we got to the proper floor, we paused for a second so Electra could catch her breath. I had no idea whether Smokey could even get fatigued in his current form, but he hadn't made an effort to change back yet, so I assumed he wasn't having any issues. The area we were in was actually a large foyer. There were lots of sofas and chairs around for sitting, as well as tables set up for board games and the like. There were 2 areas with numerous chairs laid out in rows in front of a large flat-screen television, obviously TV viewing areas. A couple of the walls had large, intricate murals painted on them, reflecting scenes of the outside world, such as children playing in a park and a woman working in her garden. All in all, the place had the vibe of one of the huge activity rooms that you see in mental hospitals in the movies. I mentally shuddered, thinking of the life Rudy and her brother were living here. "You guys go ahead," I said after a moment. "Find Rudy and Josh, their room is marked on the blueprints, and then follow the plan to get out."
What about you?
asked Electra. "They're coming," I said. "They're practically on our tail right now. I need to slow them down." I could sense that she wanted to argue with me, but then she just nodded and started moving towards a set of double doors directly across from the stairwell we'd come through. Those doors should lead right to the area where Rudy was. Smokey, floating like a cloud against the ceiling, followed her. In addition to the double doors that my friends had gone through, there were also similar doors to the left and right of the stairwell we'd entered through. Hearing footsteps on those stairs now, I raced around the room, grabbing furniture and stacking it up against the stairwell door. I was about to do the same to the side doors and was actually in the process of dragging a couch over to one of them when the door in question burst open. One of the guards stepped through, carrying an ugly-looking weapon in both hands, with a muzzle big enough to put my fist in.
Already at super speed, I watched as the guard fired. The projectile that left the barrel was somewhat bullet-shaped, although about the size of my hand, but seemed to be shooting fire out of the far end. Apparently, the weapon was some kind of handheld rocket launcher. I was close to the center of the room at the time, and I watched for a few seconds as the rocket approached. Then, I flipped the couch up lengthwise and took off towards the opposite door. About halfway to the door, curiosity got the better of me, and I turned around while backpedaling at super speed to see what would happen. It was easy enough to explain. 1 second there was a couch, the next there was kindling and toothpicks as the rocket exploded. I turned back around, ready to dash out the available side door and find some other way to my friends, when something like a sledgehammer caught me across the jaw. I went flying back towards the center of the room, close to the stairwell door that I had blocked off just a short time earlier. I shook my head, trying to clear it, but it was immediately obvious what had happened. While I was glancing back at the exploding sofa, Mr. Ponytail, the big super, had come into the room through the door I was to head out of. I'd set myself up perfectly, and when I turned back around towards the door, he'd caught me with a solid backhand. Mr. Ponytail was actually walking towards me now, striding confidently towards where I was still practically laid out on the floor. Flanking him were 2 other guards. I was tempted to head out the doors to Rudy's room, cut my losses, and try to finish the mission. But the whole point of me staying back was to buy them time. It wouldn't do much good if I made a beeline for them now with most of Chamomile's security detachment in hot pursuit. I looked towards the door where the guard with the rocket launchers stood, getting ready to make a dash by him. He obviously sensed what I was up to, because, as I shifted into super speed again, I saw his fingers start to clench on the trigger. I took a calculated risk then, telekinetically giving his hand a little nudge. With any luck, people would think it was the recoil that made him fire so wildly. Regardless, when the trigger was pulled, the rocket headed towards Mr. Ponytail, not me. I'm not sure what I expected to see. Maybe Mr. Ponytail was going to duck and take cover. Maybe he was going to simply sidestep the rocket. Maybe he was going to do what I did and throw something in its path to intercept it. What I did not expect was what actually happened. As the rocket came towards him, Mr. Ponytail reached out his hand and caught it. He then held it in his hand as its propulsion jet seemed to expend its fuel and sputter out. To say I was impressed would have been an understatement. What he did next, however, awed and astounded me. As the flames at the end of the rocket died, Mr. Ponytail must have had a premonition of what was going to happen, because he suddenly looked from the rocket to the guards with him, and then back to the rocket. Then he tucked the rocket to his midsection, wrapping his arms around it and enfolding it like a running back protecting a football. There was a muffled sound, like a giant stone statue coughing, as the rocket exploded and a concussive blast of air shot out from the big super's abdomen in various directions. It was an impressive display of both strength and power. About the only other person I could imagine doing something like that was Alpha Prime, the world's greatest superhero. Mr. Ponytail had obviously failed to completely cover the explosive, but his actions had undoubtedly saved the lives of the guards with him. Even so, the force of the explosion caught one of the guards and sent him flying through the air. He landed unconscious just a few feet away from me. As his head hit the floor, something popped out of his ear and rolled towards me. I scooped it up into my hand at super speed, hoping no one had seen me. I needn't have worried about being seen. Mr. Ponytail, upon standing up straight again, with the front of his outfit hanging in blackened, scorched tatters, only had eyes for the guard who had fired the rocket. I feigned still being dazed as he glanced at me, then marched on the guard in question. Mr. Ponytail didn't say a word.
Instead, he snatched the rocket launcher with a speed that made the guard blink. Gripping the weapon in both hands, he twisted his palms in opposite directions. Accompanied by the shriek of tearing metal, the rocket launcher came apart like papier-mâché. Mr. Ponytail turned back towards me, but before he could take a step, the entire place shook with explosions. The building rattled like dice in a cup, so badly that even the big super had trouble keeping his feet, as huge chunks of the walls and ceiling started raining down. Still not quite at 100%, I dashed for the door to the living quarters on my hands and knees, making it through just before a cavernous amount of debris fell down on the other side. After a few moments, the shaking seemed to stop, but the facility clearly had extensive damage, and even in this area, the walls had practically been shaken apart. I put my fist on the ground to brace myself to rise up, and as I did so, I felt something in my palm. After regaining my feet, I looked at what I held, the little item that had come from the guard in the activity room. It was an earpiece. The guard had probably had a microphone of some sort on him too, but I didn't need that. I slid it into my ear and headed towards the direction of Rudy's room, eavesdropping on a conversation that was already in progress.
"What's that?"
asked a male voice.
At a guess, Spence, I'd say it was the generator in the main power plant blowing up, said a deep voice.
"What?"
The man named Spence asked incredulously.
"You guys blew up the generator?"
No, that would be your boy Plasmatic, came the response. He panicked a little and started firing plasma bolts like they were candy he was giving out on Halloween. One of them struck the generator, and at this point it's probably safe to say the whole power plant's gone.
"Jeez, Megaton, how'd that happen?"
I'm surprised it didn't happen sooner. This is what happens when you put someone in the field who isn't ready.
"Guys,"
said the somewhat whiny voice of Plasmatic.
"you know I'm right here listening along with everybody else."
At this point, I came across Electra and Smokey standing in the midst of a huge pile of rubble. I switched to normal speed, causing Electra to glance in my direction. The explosions had really done a number on this part of the building. Looking around, I could see a sink here, a coffee table there, a bedroom set, etc. These had been multiple living quarters, and the walls between most of them, as well as a good part of the ceilings, had come down. "Well, where's Rudy's room?" I asked after taking in the view. Electra didn't say anything. I looked in her direction, and I saw her lift her goggles to wipe at tears in her eyes. I also felt sadness welling up in her. And the truth hit me. One of these rooms was Rudy's, and Josh's. The place had come down on top of them. For one brief moment, I screamed mentally, if not out loud, falling to my knees in anguish. "Rudy!" My empathic senses exploded outwards, searching for something, anything that might indicate she was alive. "Rudy!" I was about to mentally call her a third time when I felt it. A brash attitude and youthful boldness covering a protective and nurturing spirit, like a rose decked out in a suit of armor. I reached for her telepathically.
"Finally," she said in exasperation. "You took your precious time trying to locate me."
"I've been reaching out for you since we got here," I answered defensively. "I never got so much as a peep."
"They had a psychic watching me, a telepath, from the next room over. I had to stay bottled up, mentally and emotionally, or she would have known something was up."
"So you knew we were coming?"
"Duh."
"Where's the psychic now?"
"Buried under a wall. She'll have a nasty concussion and a few broken bones, but she'll be fine."
"And you guys are the only residents in this part of the building?"
"Of course not,"
she answered, mentally rolling her eyes.
"There's a movie theater in one of the other underground wings. They're all over there watching some new release. getting trained to be docile little hostages.
Well, why aren't you and Josh over there?
Because we're sick,
she said with a mental wink, clearly proud of the way she had pulled the wool over the eyes of some grown-up. I smiled. Same old Rudy. I looked at Electra. They're alive. Part 3. It only took us a few minutes to locate Rudy and Josh. Being precognitive, she'd seen what was going to happen. Thus, she had dragged the mattresses from both their beds into the bathroom, and they had gotten into the bathtub with the mattresses on top. Some of the rubble had fallen on top of them, but they were essentially unharmed. I looked Rudy over. She was a spunky 10-year-old with an olive complexion, green eyes, and curly brown hair. I'd gotten an image of her in my mind when she helped me before, but this was the first time we'd met in the flesh. Her brother Josh was basically a younger male version of his sister, although he had brown eyes instead of green. While I checked to make sure Rudy and Josh were okay, Electra took Smokey's stealth suit from my backpack and placed it behind one of the few still-standing walls in the immediate vicinity. Smokey, in mist form, billowed in that direction and disappeared. A few minutes later, he reappeared, human and in his stealth suit. Now came the part of my plan that was a little crazy.
Rudy, I said, turning to her, we were able to get in on our own, but we need you to get us out. Can you handle it? Piece of cake, she said, snapping her fingers.
I breathed a sigh of relief, as did Smokey and Electra. This had been the part of the plan they considered insane. I had seen Rudy in action before, and her precognitive abilities were first-rate, even for a 10-year-old. Thus, it had seemed like genius to me when, trying to formulate a plan, I had latched onto the notion of letting Rudy do the heavy lifting with respect to getting out. That said, I hadn't realized how much I was dreading asking her about it, how fearful I was of the response, until Rudy actually said she could do it. And she was true to her word. With Rudy leading the way, we suddenly became will-o'-the-wisps. We either slipped past guards or avoided them altogether. Again, I was simply amazed at her ability to not just see the future, but to use it to her advantage. She kept the directions simple as we traveled. Stop, go, turn, duck, crawl. Since my job at this point was to simply be a mindless automaton, I turned back to listening to what was being said via the earpiece.
Haven't you found them yet?
Spence was asking.
Because you've got men running back and forth hunting for these people when it's completely unnecessary, Megaton answered. The only way out is the way they got in, the ventilation shafts. Just monitor those for air obstructions like you did before, and we'll know exactly where they are.
We have been monitoring them, and nothing's shown up yet.
Well, it will. It's a good thing the air monitors operate on the backup power system. Otherwise, they would have slipped right by when the main grid went offline.
Of course, that's how they found us. Down here, air was part of their life support system. It made sense that they would monitor it constantly for any obstructions. When we came through the vents, we were blocking airflow, and some system of theirs must have picked that up. And when we switched shafts and started going in a different direction, that must have been like watching something that you thought was a meteor suddenly stop, hover, and change direction in the nighttime sky. It was obvious that something was moving through the vents with intent and purpose. All they needed to do was look at the schematics to see where the shaft ended to know exactly where we'd pop up. Following that, all they had to do was wait. I felt incredibly stupid, and I'm sure Smokey and Electra would as well when I got around to telling them later. However, we still had to get out of here. A short time later, we found ourselves in a room that looked shockingly familiar. We were in a large tunnel, and before us stood a giant fan. However, it wasn't the same room as before because this fan was a little smaller and the blades were shaped differently. Rudy pointed to a nearby electronic panel.
That controls the fan here, she said, and connects to the backup generator.
She turned to Electra.
You need to short out the backup generator like you did the first one.
Electra nodded, and a few seconds later, it was done. However, even with the power gone, the giant fan still had enough momentum to keep turning, at least for a little while. There was also a noticeable change in the acoustics, and it took me a few seconds to realize that there had previously been an electrical droning in the air, but that it was now gone. It was the work of a few seconds to pick everybody up and zip them through the blades at super speed. However, just as I got the last of them through, the door to the room flew open and Plasmatic stepped in. He didn't look particularly happy, and, perhaps more importantly, he exuded a feeling of reckless abandon and mindless desperation. Apparently having Megaton withhold his stamp of approval, on the airwaves no less, made Plasmatic all the more anxious to prove himself. The blades of the fan were still spinning too fast for someone without superspeed to get through. Nevertheless, he could see us on the other side moving away. Plasmatic clenched his fists and screamed in frustration. Then he pulled back his arm like a pitcher trying to strike someone out in the bottom of the ninth and threw a massive plasma blast at us. His shot hit one of the spinning blades, and suddenly there was a mad clanging sound from the fan, like someone ringing a misshapen bell. There was the distinctive shriek of metal tearing, and then the end of one of the fan blades came loose and flew straight at Plasmatic. He dove to the ground, squealing as the piece of fan blade that his plasma bolt had torn loose missed him by inches before embedding itself in the wall. Despite having almost killed himself, Plasmatic recovered quickly. He looked at us angrily, but after such a narrow escape, he was unlikely to try anything so foolish again. We left him standing there, staring at our disappearing backs.
"They're back in the vent shafts," Plasmatic said over the earpiece. "I almost had 'em."
He then gave an exaggerated account of his encounter with us.
"If they're in the vents, then we do have them," Megaton said.
"No."
This came from Spence.
"The backup generator is now offline. Our sensors for tracking airflow obstructions are down."
"Then they're home free,"
Megaton said.
"Maybe not," said Spence. "We know where they're likely to come out, but they probably know that we know. What if they're just planning to double back?"
"Fine. We'll check all shaft exits that extend from where Plasmatic saw them,"
Megaton answered. The earpiece was essentially silent from that point on, except for the occasional "all clear" with respect to a shaft exit. We were all following Rudy at this point, exhibiting blind faith in her ability to get us out. We were now approaching what she said was the last door.
That's it,
she said.
We get through that doorway and we're home free.
That must have jinxed it because suddenly we heard a bolt being thrown, and a second later the door started to open. Subconsciously, I slipped into a fighting stance, ready to take out whoever came through the door. Suddenly, Rudy grabbed my hand.
No, she said. Don't do anything.
I debated. We didn't have any other friends here. The only people on the other side of that door had to be hostiles. And yet, we hadn't really had any issues since letting Rudy lead the way. In fact, I had trusted her to get us out when I barely had a plan for getting us in. It only made sense that I trust her again. The door opened up, and the light in the background cast the person standing there in silhouette. I had never seen him before today, but I immediately knew who it was, especially when his eyes put forth a baleful yellow light that swept over all of us before coming back to rest on me. "Anything there, Megaton?" asked a voice that I heard almost in stereo, both over the earpiece and coming from the room behind him. Megaton stood there for a few seconds, with all of us watching him expectantly. Then, he said something that shocked me deep to the core.
"All clear,"
Megaton said.
We were still standing there, unable to believe our ears, when I heard the voice behind Megaton and over the earpiece sound again. "Megaton, you okay?" the person asked.
"Yeah, keep checking the other shafts."
There was the sound of footsteps moving away, and a few seconds later, Megaton motioned us out. We were in another power plant, although this one seemed to have a lagoon off to one side of it. As Megaton escorted us over to the water, Spence's voice crackled over the earpiece. "Megaton," Spence said, "where are you?"
"I'm getting ready to go through the vents to the fans," Megaton responded.
"Scratch that. We need you over by the elevator. It's not working since we lost power. But if we can get you into the elevator shaft, you can manually pull the cables and get it to the surface. Then we might have a chance of catching these people."
"Negatory on that," said Megaton.
"What do you mean, negatory? You get your butt over here."
"You seem to forget, Spence, that I don't work for you. My role here is to assist in the overall mission, not to serve your whims."
"But they'll get away! What's more important than stopping the people who broke in here?" Spence sounded desperate.
"Staying alive," Megaton answered. "You seem to forget that with the emergency generator down, the air handlers aren't working. I'm going to go turn them by hand until you can get some engineers out of lockdown and down here to fix things."
"But they'll get away!" Spence seemed to whine.
"Let 'em," Megaton answered. "But without those fans turning, the air down here will turn real bad real fast, and even I have to breathe. Think about whether you'd rather chase these people or suffocate."
He turned his earpiece and mic off. At that point, we were at the edge of the water, and it was then that Smokey seemed to catch on. "This little lagoon," he said. "It's part of the underground river here. It provides hydroelectric power for the backup generator." "You really are a bright and shiny penny," said Rudy. She turned to me and held out her hand. "Your earpiece, please?" I debated only a second before handing it to her, not even wondering how she knew I had it, then turned back to the conversation at hand. "So this is how we get out," Electra was saying. "Any idea how far it is until it breaks the surface?" I shrugged. "Couple of miles, I think. We'll have to share the rebreathers." I turned to speak to Rudy, but saw her hurrying to catch up to Megaton, who had walked away from us without a word. I saw Rudy hand him something, presumably the earpiece, and then he glanced at me before turning to her and mumbling something I couldn't catch. Then he turned and continued walking away as Rudy dashed back to us. "Okay," she said with a grin. "I'm ready to take a dip." "Wait," I said, an idea suddenly occurring to me. "If everything's shut down, then my entire reason for only using one power, so they can't figure out who I am, goes out the window. I can teleport us out, or phase us through the walls." "No," said Rudy. "Not yet." "Why not?" asked Smokey. "Because I said so, that's why," Rudy insisted, hands on her hips. "Now let's go." Traveling by underground river is different, and will give you a story to tell the grandkids one day, but it is not highly recommended. We ended up letting Rudy and Josh, who, brave little fellow that he was, never once whined or cried, use 2 of the rebreathers while Smokey, Electra, and I shared the third. It really wasn't a particularly long trip, only about 20 minutes. Thankfully, the river never went too fast and there weren't a lot of obstructions. The point at which we came up wasn't really the end of the river. In fact, it was another underground cavern where the water formed a lagoon much like the one that we originally entered. "Now you can teleport us if you want," said Rudy as we trudged up out of the water. "Oh? So what was wrong with before?" I asked. "Josh and I have subcutaneous trackers," she said nonchalantly. "What?" I practically screamed. Smokey and Electra were also bug-eyed over this news.
tracking devices under our skin, she said. Kind of like GPS. So those goons at Chamomile know where we are? Asked Smokey. No, Rudy said, shaking her head. After we left, there was another series of explosions that destroyed the tracking equipment. But I fried both the main power grid and the backup, Electra said. Why was the tracking device still working? It works differently, kind of like email, Rudy replied. When we all looked at her blankly, she went on. You know how if your email goes down, the messages just kind of pile up? Then, when your email comes back on, all the messages are still there? Even those that someone sent to you while your account wasn't working?
Yeah, I said.
The tracking worked the same way. The info was still being recorded. The tracking system has its own battery for that purpose, and whenever the main power came online again, they'd be able to see what happened.
So if I had teleported you out, I said, the system would have recorded that?
It would have seen us wink out and reappear somewhere else, which would mean teleportation,
Rudy replied.
But if you knew it was going to be destroyed before the data could be retrieved, why couldn't Jim just teleport us back at Chamomile? Because I didn't know it would be destroyed,
Rudy answered.
I couldn't see that far into the future concerning the tracking, but I did see that Jim would be able to safely teleport us later. So I'm sorry that I don't know everything.
I'm not sure how well that satisfied Electra and Smokey, but it was apparently the best any of us were going to get. As I got ready to teleport us out, I felt an odd sensation, like a butterfly fluttering around my face, trying to attract notice. After a moment, I recognized it as Rudy shooting some strong emotions my way in order to get my attention. She wasn't a telepath, at least not yet, but this was something she had done before to get me to notice her telepathically. What is it? I asked.
I just wanted to say thanks, but I didn't want it to get all mushy in front of your friends.
I felt her give me a mental hug and smiled. Hey, before I forget, how did you get Megaton to help us back there? I asked.
Me?
She asked incredulously.
He didn't help us out because of me or anything I did. He helped us out because of you.
Now it was my turn to be surprised. Why would he want to help me? I've never seen him before in my life.
Well, if it helps, he told me to give you a message, although it's not really for you. It's for someone else.
Now that was really weird. What was the message? I asked, totally nonplussed.
He said to tell Mr. Morrison that he said hello.
I stood there stunned. This was more than just a shock. It was completely unreal.
Jim, do you know a Mr. Morrison?
I swallowed and nodded almost instinctively. Of course I knew a Mr. Morrison. In fact, I only knew one Mr. Morrison. Although only a few people were aware of it. Morrison was the actual surname of the world's greatest superhero. Alpha Prime. My father. About the only secret better kept than his name was the fact that I was Alpha Prime's son. Still, the fact that this man, Megaton, whom I had never seen before today, knew my father's name had to be significant in some way. Now I was wishing I could go back in time and speak to him. Did he say anything else? Anything at all? I asked, barely keeping desperation out of my voice. But if what she'd said before stunned me, her answer this time left me completely stupefied, unable to fully process what I was hearing.
Yeah,
Rudy responded.
He said that Mr. Morrison was his brother.
This has been Extraction, a kid sensation story. Written by Kevin Hardman. Narrated by Michael Naramore. Copyright 2013 by Kevin Hardman. Production copyright 2017 by Kevin Hardman.
Audible hopes you have